If someone told you they were going to walk all the way from the southernmost tip of South America back to their hometown in the UK without ever stepping foot in a car or a plane, and without ever visiting home until it was over, you'd think they were completely out of their mind. Yet, one of the most extreme legends in modern adventure history began as nothing more than a casual bar bet. In 1998, 29-year-old Karl Bushby had just finished an 11-year stint with the British Army's Parachute Regiment. Lost, directionless, and battling severe depression and anxiety, he was desperate for something monumental to redefine his life. One evening at a pub, his friends confidently declared, "It's absolutely impossible for anyone to walk from South America back to Britain." That single sentence ignited something fierce in Karl. He accepted the challenge on the spot. Mapping out his route, he drew a line starting from the tip of South America, cutting through the Americas, crossing the Bering Strait, and spanning the massive Eurasian continent all the way back to his hometown of Kingston upon Hull. He called it the Goliath Expedition and bound himself to a strict, non-negotiable rule. Every single step moving toward home had to be on his own 2 feet. He originally thought it would take 8 years. He had no idea this walk would swallow the next 27 years of his life. Leaving Punta Arenas, Chile, Karl headed straight up the west coast of South America. For the first few months, he was greeted by the brutal, bone-crushing winds of the Patagonian plateau, forcing him to literally lie flat across his modified, 2-wheeled supply cart just to avoid being blown away. Next came the Atacama Desert in Peru, the driest place on Earth. The ground was so blistering hot it could melt the soles of his shoes, forcing him to trek under the moonlight after the sun went down, surviving on whatever tiny water holes he could find every few dozen miles. After finally dragging himself through Colombia, the ultimate nightmare was waiting for him at the Darién Gap on the Panamanian border. This is the only break in the highway system connecting North and South America, a lawless stretch of pure jungle and bottomless mud pits. Karl pushed his hundreds of pounds of gear through waist-deep sludge, inch by inch. The jungle was crawling with venomous pit vipers, bullet ants, and heavily armed drug cartels. He spent 2 grueling months fighting his way through, covered in open sores and tropical ulcers, and was even thrown into a detention cell for 18 days by local authorities. By the time he finally crawled out the other side, reeking and severely malnourished, the local tribespeople looked at him like he was a ghost. Emerging from the jungle, Karl finally set foot in Central America. He endured the suffocating heat of Mexico along its endless coastline before crossing the border into the United States. He pushed north along the highways, cut across the Great Plains, and conquered Canada's sprawling Rocky Mountains. As he moved higher into the latitudes, the sweltering heat gradually gave way to the numbing, sub-zero chill of the Arctic Circle. Years later, he finally reached the edge of Alaska. Standing before him was the Bering Strait, a 50-mile stretch of frozen, treacherous ocean separating the Americas from Asia. To tackle this frozen expanse, Karl teamed up with a French adventurer named Dimitri, who was just as crazy as he was. In March 2006, they set off into the teeth of an Arctic blizzard. It was a moving hell of ice. The massive floes beneath their feet could fracture and collapse into the abyss at any second. Hauling their sleds, they spent 14 days leaping and scrambling across a chaotic 150-mile detour of shifting pack ice. Surviving severe frostbite and several near-fatal plunges into the freezing ocean, they miraculously stepped onto the solid ground of Chukotka, Russia, completing the first-ever crossing of the Bering Strait on foot from America to Asia. But before they could even celebrate, Karl collided with something far colder than nature: human politics and bureaucracy. Because they had walked straight across the ice and hadn't gone through an official border checkpoint, he and his partner were immediately detained by Russian border guards, facing a permanent ban. At the 11th hour, the crisis escalated all the way to the top. Following urgent negotiations between Britain's deputy prime minister and the billionaire governor of Chukotka, Chelsea FC owner Roman Abramovich, a Russian court finally granted them a reprieve. But the real administrative nightmare was just beginning. Over the next decade, Karl was trapped in an endless loop of visa hell. His Russian visas were constantly approved, revoked, and frozen. He was restricted to staying only 90 days out of every 180. And because he was trekking through high-security military zones, the paperwork was suffocating. To make matters worse, once the Siberian snow melted in May, the entire region dissolved into an impassable maze of rivers and swamps, meaning he could only walk during a tiny window from late winter to early spring. Whenever his visa expired or the seasons shifted, he was forced to pack up and leave the country. Trapped in this agonizing stop-and-go pattern, Karl hit another wall at the end of 2008 when the global financial crisis struck. His major corporate sponsors collapsed and pulled their funding overnight, leaving him completely broke. With the cost of living in Alaska and Canada astronomically high, staying there would mean financial ruin. Yet, fiercely bound by his rule of never returning to the UK until the journey was finished, he had only one choice: head south to Mexico, where life was cheap and visa regulations for British citizens were far more relaxed. He ended up stranded there for 2 solid years. Living on pennies and scrambling for a lifeline, he finally secured brand new sponsors in 2010. By the spring of 2011, with his funds replenished, Karl flew back to the exact spot he left off in Siberia, resuming his grueling trek inch by inch until he reached Srednikolimsk. But in 2013, fate dealt him a devastating blow. Russia slapped him with a blanket 5-year entry ban. It looked like the absolute death sentence for the Goliath Expedition. But Karl refused to quit. Backed by the National Geographic Society, he did something incredibly bold. Since he couldn't go back to Russia, he set off on foot from Los Angeles on the U.S. West Coast and walked 3,000 miles all the way to the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. to personally petition for his return. His sheer determination moved the officials. The embassy lifted the ban and issued him a new visa. By 2015, Karl was back in Yakutsk, pushing west until he crossed into Mongolia in 2017. Yet, the universe wasn't done throwing hurdles his way. In 2019, he made it into Uzbekistan and prepared to cross Iran. Then, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and combined with sudden visa complications, his journey ground to a halt yet again. Worse still, by 2022, the geopolitical landscape fractured entirely. Traveling by land through Iran or Russia on a British passport became a high-risk gamble, and the borders ahead were slammed shut. Faced with an insurmountable wall, anyone else would have thrown in the towel. But Karl, now in his 50s and a notoriously poor swimmer, made an unbelievably daring pivot in August 2024. He decided to swim across the Caspian Sea, the largest inland body of water on Earth, to bypass the dangerous territories entirely. He teamed up with an American adventurer and 2 Azerbaijani national swimmers, backed by a support vessel. Obviously, he couldn't swim 180 miles continuously. They swam for about 6 hours a day in the punishing swells, and when they were completely spent, they climbed onto the support boat to eat and sleep, diving back into the exact spot they left off the next morning. Through this grueling, painstaking relay, Karl spent 132 hours in the water over 31 days, pushing from Kazakhstan all the way to Azerbaijan, once again forcing his way through a geopolitical dead end using pure, unadulterated human effort. After conquering the Caspian, he pressed on through Turkey, crossed the Bosphorus Strait, and officially left Asia behind to enter the European continent. Over these 27 years, he has traversed 6 deserts, climbed 7 mountain ranges, missed his son growing up, and spent decades away from family holidays. He left as a 29-year-old young man. Today, he is a silver-haired 57-year-old veteran. Plenty of people have mocked him, calling him a stubborn contrarian escaping reality. But Karl's perspective is incredibly simple, because I said I would do it. If I stop now, the last 20 years of suffering mean absolutely nothing. Now, in 2026, Karl is on the final stretch across Europe. Only France and the English Channel stand between him and home. He will cross that last body of water using whatever human-powered means necessary, finally putting his feet back on British soil. This epic odyssey, born from a casual pub wager, paid for with half a lifetime of sacrifice, and spanning nearly 3 decades, is finally, step by agonizing step, nearing its long-awaited destination.